Following the collapse of the British Empire, many Caribbean nations still retain the British monarch as their head of state. Yet that legacy does not seem as secure as it once did. Last year, Barbados made the decision to ditch Queen Elizabeth and become a republic. Now, the passing of the Queen has shone a fresh light on whether these nations really want to carry on their relationship with the British Crown. Antigua and Barbuda is the latest state to flirt with becoming a republic. Their Prime Minister, Gaston Browne, has said that he will call a referendum on whether they should ditch King Charles as head of state. He explained the move to ITV like this.
This is not an act of hostility or any difference between Antigua and Barbuda and the monarchy, but it is the final step, as I said before, to complete that circle of independence, to ensure that we are truly a sovereign nation.
What sort of time frame would you think on a referendum then?
So I'd say within the next probably 3 years.
Browne made that referendum commitment just after signing a document confirming Charles's status as the new king. But it's not the first time he's indicated to the royal family a desire for a break with Britain. Earlier this year, the Earl and Countess of Wessex visited the Caribbean nation and were told by Browne to use their diplomatic influence to achieve reparatory justice. He also told the couple that the country intended to become a republic. Another nation questioning its relationship to the crown is Jamaica, whose Prime Minister Andrew Holness told William and Kate earlier this year that the country is moving on and intends to become an independent nation. That trip by Will and Kate was also met with many protests and some pretty awkward photo opportunities like this. It was branded tone deaf for visually harking back to the colonial era. Aaron, there are currently 14 nations still retaining the monarchy as their head of state, or the British monarch, sorry. Might that number be about to shrink?
Absolutely, Michael. And I think it's in good taste, to obviously not talk about this before even the funeral of the Queen, and I think they'll probably wait till even the coronation of Charles. There'll be mentions of it, of course, but in terms of substantive moves to become republics, I think we're obviously not going to see it in the next several months, but it's coming. I think in particular as well, Australia. I mean, you do have a PM in Australia, Albanese, who's a confirmed Republican. He said, I think in the last week, that there are no plans in the first term of his government to become a republic. But that to me seems like quite a studied response, which he's clearly put a lot of thought into. There's no rush to do it, but we're going to do it. It's not a first-time issue. When you're not going to do something, you don't say that. You say we're not going to do it. But a first-time issue means it's politically a bit of a hot potato. But yes, it's something we're going to look at. The West Indian context, obviously, a bit different, and very different sort of economic model as well. These countries are wholly different to somewhere like Canada or Australia. Canada, of course, a G7 economy. Canada is perhaps the last one that may become a republic because you basically need the say-so, I think, of both legislative houses. You need the say-so of the Prime Minister, obviously, and all of the regions also have to kind of consent to it or assent to it. So Canada, who knows? But I think for the West Indian countries, Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda and Antigua, and I think Australia, and I think New Zealand, there have been whispers about this from Jacinda Ardern as well. This may be the hallmark of Prince Charles's tenure as king. The departure, really, the ultimate demise of the country's overseas territories and these countries becoming republics. And I mean, they should do. I personally find it very strange that a country the size of Canada or Australia doesn't have their own head of state. I mean, go there. They're very large countries in their own right. I find it weird, personally. If I was Canadian or Australian, I would find it weird. But, each to their own.
This is kind of obvious. I should have thought of this before. But I mean, obviously the head of state here does have a constitutional role in the sense that sort of like, she formally dissolves parliament, etc., after being asked. Those parliamentary systems, does she play the same role? Is it the case that if there's a constitutional crisis, they have to come to our king or queen?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it is substantially different, but there is evidence historically, quite recently. If you look at the Gough Whitlam Labour government in Australia, a very radical government, arguably the most radical government of the Commonwealth countries in the post-war era. Arguably, he was a very left-wing politician. He's more left-wing as an individual than Attlee, for instance, in the UK after 45. Then there was a hatchet job done on him by the Australian establishment, and the Crown played its role. Would that happen today? Hard to see, really. So I don't know about the technicalities, Michael, but the Crown has certainly played a quite interventionist role in the politics of these countries, even though ostensibly they claim to be, sovereign liberal democracies.
There are also many points to make why a country like Jamaica, which was colonized by Britain, subjected to the slave trade, will have a different attitude to the monarchy than people who live in Britain, which, in many respects benefited from empire. That's obviously the fundamental background here. I also do, though, think there could be something about how you react to the secession of the Queen by the King if you are not bombarded 24 hours a day with all of the propaganda that we are. Because obviously in this country, you've got all of this talk of, you have got a genuine sort of quite extraordinary amount of people going to queue to see the Queen, but then that sort of has an effect, has a ripple effect. I think people think, oh, there are this many people queuing to see the Queen. That means there must be something about her. We have quite successfully, I think, as a country been taken on this journey where we say, oh, Charles, he is bereaved. We need to have sympathy for him. We need to accept him becoming king. It's very well choreographed in this country because of the relationship between the BBC and the establishment and politicians in Westminster. I'm sure that's not happening to the extent it is here anywhere else. It might be that it's barely happening at all in some of these countries. So it's not surprising that while the Queen's death here, I think, has actually shored up support for the monarchy, elsewhere it could have the opposite effect because people thought, oh, Queen Elizabeth, she wasn't that bad. And also they're now reminded of sort of the archaic structures and processes which they've sort of allowed to be their head of state. Do you think I'm on the right track there, Aaron?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's the UK, actually. I think it's particularly England, Michael. I do think it's particularly England, what we're seeing. And the royal family and the role of the monarchy does interface with a certain kind of Anglo-UK nationalism. Let's not get into too a sort of arcane debate around the nature of Britain. But even in the 1970s with the Silver Jubilee, it was being observed by sociologists that actually Scots weren't as enthused about this as English people. It's just a very different sociological reality. And I think that's diverged over time. Now, if the peripheries of the UK have a different relationship to this institution, i.e. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland's more complicated, but let's just stick with Wales and Scotland, then I think you're absolutely right. Then of course, Canada, New Zealand, Australia are going to have an even more different relationship to the monarch. And it is important to insist on this point, Michael. This is the aftermath of empire. I know the British pundits and journalists and the media don't like to talk about it, but this is an imperial institution. Her father, her uncle were king emperors. Queen Elizabeth II was the first of recent generations of British monarchs to not have that role. She was kind of this strange stopgap between the end of empire and British being this new sovereign nation state, which is what it is today. And with her going, of course, I just don't see how Charles III and his successors are the head of state for somewhere like Australia. Canada, institutionally different because, like I said, it's so complicated. But in general, I just don't see how it works.